so now I went ahead, I installed that ground that I was mentioning previously. I just went from the pump ground down to the fuel level sender ground, and then zip tied it away and around so it doesn't interfere with this level sensor. We can go ahead and we're going to mark the positive and the negative for the fuel pump. I like to just take a Sharpie, do a positive on the side, and then negative on this side. So your power and your ground, just reference for the power wire for the fuel pump and the ground wire for the fuel pump, so you'll mix them up, spin the pump backwards. And then if you want to, if you don't know exactly which two wires these are, go ahead and take a photo and then reference it at the top when you go and you install it in the tank. Next up, we're going to be using a new fuel tank O-ring. We put these kits together. It does come with new hardware. If your hardware is still good, you can go ahead and reuse it. This is just a Phillips head hardware, so it's not desirable, but it does get the job done if yours are broken or missing. So now that we have the tank cleaned out, we're going to place the O-ring on top and place our fuel pump assembly back inside the tank. And then you can go ahead and you can reinstall your fuel pump hanger bolts. Okay, now that we have our fuel pump hat assembly installed, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to change the fuel injection high pressure clamp and reinstall the fuel lines. So I've gone ahead and replaced both fuel injection hose clamps that were on there with new ones. You're always going to want to use fuel injection clamp for this type of application. It's similar to the OEM one as well. This will prevent any sort of pinching or ripping of the hose when you install these ones. The worm gear clamps with the gaps in the middle will pull rubber through them and damage the line. So always make sure you're using these. This clamp wasn't necessary for here. It did have a squish clamp on here before, but I figured if I'm doing one side, may as well do the other. All right, so next up, we're going to go ahead, we're going to modify this harness now. If you're only doing the two studs, the power and the ground, your harness is in good shape. You were able to remove these without breaking them, and you're only using the two studs. You can go ahead and just skip a couple of these steps. You're not going to have to reconnect these ones, but we're going to go ahead, we're going to remove these two wires. This is your pump power, the white and purple, and this is your pump ground, the blue and red. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to pull these through and remove them from the connector. These are going to now be no longer used, and we'll reinstall new upgraded wire. So when you're removing these wires, this is your power, the pink and or the white and purple, and your ground, blue and red. You're going to want to reference the power wire. We're going to be using that for our relay trigger. One reason to reference it is because when you plug it in here, say you remove these pins, you're not paying attention which one's which, the color of wire does change. So on this side, it's going to be the black and yellow as the pump power. We're going to peel this back as well, and we're going to expose that wire. We're going to use it as our pump trigger. If you do want to depin this, it's very easy. Most people just snip off the wires, leave them really short, call it good. We like to remove the pins themselves, so remove your lock off the back of this connector, and then you're going to want to reach down in here. There's two little tabs. So we'll peel it back and pull your pin out. This is just a homemade pick tool that we use for these. It's a lot of leverage, easy to access. There are specialty tools for this, but this seems to work nicely. All right, so now that we've gone ahead and removed those two wires, you should be left with just a couple. These two wires are fuel level sender and the fuel low level light. And then we're going to add some new wires in. Our power and ground wires for the fuel pump are going to go past this because the gauge of wire is going to be so big. We typically don't add a connector unless there's a lot of service that needs to be required. It'll disconnect from the fuel pump hat. So we'll show you that later on here in the video. So we're going to use the larger crimps for the top. These ones fit quite nice on top, and they look a lot better as far as when they have shrink wrap on them. So we'll go ahead, we'll just shrink wrap this off here. It's the perfect size for the stud on top, so this is what we're going to use. So we got those together. We're going to go ahead and we'll shrink wrap those down, install them to the fuel pump hanger, and then we'll go ahead and run our power and ground wire. All right, so here we have our fuel level sender and our fuel low level light installed. Then we have our positive and negative marked here. Positives far right, negatives the middle one here. I did it just like factory. You can move these around however you want, but this is the OEM positioning. We're going to go ahead now and we're going to install our power and ground. All right, so now we have the correct gauge of wire that we're going to be using that is designed to handle this level of amperage. So now you'll see, obviously the crimp connector fits just on there perfectly. Go ahead and just crimp that down. then go ahead and install your shrink wrap. So we've crimped our power and ground wire. We're going to go ahead and we're going to install these to the hat. This wire is going to be going to the power side on the relay, and this one's going to be going to the chassis. The ground wire is going to go in the chassis. Okay, so I do like to install the power and ground wires together before I attach them to anything, so I get the lengths right. So now there's a couple things you can do. I have tried in the past to kind of try to feed these wires through this loom that's already here. That's been proven to be quite hard to do in the past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the lengths right here. I'm going to loom them together, and then I'm going to run it through this boot, and then we'll show you what that looks like when we're done. All right, so step one here, usually I just like to tape the wire together so it's nice and uniform down to the lengths. So now we go ahead and put this in here and tuck it underneath. The lengths make sense, and it'll run through here. We'll go ahead and we'll show you the next step. So now we've gone ahead, we've loomed our 2 power and ground wires for our fuel pump. I have ran it through the boot here, as you can see. Cable tied it at the correct length from the edge of the boot to this piece here. We'll show you in a second. And then it runs around here, loops underneath here. So when you install the hat, it sits nicely and flat, but still allows you to pull it away, out of your way when you go to, if you have to ever remove that again. It's not too short, so you can't pull it. So we'll go ahead and we're going to install that now, just like that. Now that we've got the fuel pump wiring in, our hat is on, we're going to go ahead, we're going to remove the power wire from this connector that is going to be used as our signal for our fuel pump relay. Same thing as before, still remove the rear top connector of the rear cap off the connector here, and then we're going to go in here, we're going to remove the lock, and we're going to pull that wire out. All right, so now that we have the wiring and loom pulled back in here, I've removed the power wire, or previous power wire for the fuel pump. You can go ahead, you can loom this wire back up, we're not going to need that, and then you can reattach your power wires back up to the side here. This is a wire we're going to be using as our signal to the fuel pump relay. Okay, so we've gone ahead and strapped our wire together. We have the 3 connections we're going to need ready to go here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mount our relay. This is just a 40 amp relay. It's sealed, so it can be used outside of the car as well. We're going to just mount it inside the wheel well here, or inside the trunk cargo. Okay, so we've mounted our relay just in behind here. Be careful not to use the clip hole. The interior panel does go over here like this, and there is a clip hole there, so be careful not to use that. So now we're going to go ahead, we're going to make our connections here. We've got our power, ground, and signal for the relay. We have our 4 relay connections. Now we're going to install the power wire from the battery to the back of the car. So we'll go up front and we'll talk about that. So I've already ran the power wire for the fuel pump. But we're going to talk about how we've done it. So I like to install the relay or the fuse inside the fuse box, just like factory would be. So I pretty much leave a little bit of slack in here. And you're able to remove the cap for the fuel pump, or the fuel pump fuse holder. And you can just leave it in there, tuck it in, put your cap on. So what I've done is just ran the power wire from the battery, which is going to be this connection. We'll do this connection from the battery inside the fuse box, from the fuse inside the fuse box, out down along the underside of the car, and then we'll talk about that next. There's not a lot to look at under here, but we pretty much ran the wire along the brake line and fuel lines here. We always try to loom it. Any sort of vibration on a sharp edge could cut into the wire and damage it, prevent it, or cause a short, and then you lose your fuel pump power. So we just ran it along the fuel lines here. We just ran the power wire up into the factory ABS wiring hole. This car does not have ABS or all-wheel drive, so the hole is completely vacant. It just has a rubber grommet there. So we've gone ahead and just punched a hole in the rubber grommet and gone up through the OEM hole and into the trunk. So now that we've ran the wire up into the trunk, we're going to go ahead and we're going to run it pretty much along where the factory wiring would go, up along the side here. With this factory wiring, we'll come down. We'll maybe try to integrate it into here if we can. I might go in through the backside. So we'll show you what that looks like when we're done. So we just ran the power wire around back here, up along this other wiring here, and then in through where the trunk latch and gas cap latch goes, and then it just comes back around into the relay on the backside. We have all of our connections in the trunk. We've ran our power wire from the front of the car. We have our 4 relay connections, and we have our fuel pump connections. We can go ahead and start connecting wires together. All right, so for the larger gauge connection, which is the power wire, main power wire for the fuel pump, we're going to be using a different kind of connection. This is for pretty much a wire that's strong enough to withstand a little bit of a different kind of force. Because this is a large gauge wire, we're going to go ahead, we're going to use these ones. It's unshielded connection, so we'll go ahead and run some shrink wrap over it afterwards. So we double crimp these ones, 2 connections, do a pull test, make sure it's on there good. Once we got it double crimped and our connections made, pull test again, make sure it's good and strong. Run your shrink wrap over top, and we'll heat that down. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next wire here. The other wire is going to be the power from the battery up front. So we're just going to repeat the steps, and we'll move on to the smaller gauge wires, and I'll show you the crimp connector we use there. One thing I want to mention with the relay as we're wiring it, if you notice on the top of a relay there's a little bit of a diagram here. You can see at the bottom here we got a little bit of a squiggly line. That represents a resistor. On this relay, it doesn't matter which way you connect your power or ground, but some relays do have a diode in them, so it does matter which way you connect your power or ground. And the reason for that is when you close the relay or shut the relay off, there's a voltage collapse and a voltage spike that can cause some interference in electronics around it. So be careful, pay attention to what your relay says, and then Google or search up the exact meaning for that diagram and which way you're supposed to wire it, so you don't end up with any sort of interference in your system or any problems. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to connect the smaller wire. This is our power wire from our previous fuel pump. The reason we do that this way is use the previous fuel pump power wire is we're pretty much non-invasive when we install this fuel pump into the car. We removed a little bit of factory wiring, but we're not going into any of the OEM trigger wires or systems here. So if you have a problem in the system from factory, your OEM fuse will still work. Your OEM relay still does part of its job. So if you have a problem, you have a couple places to look, and it'll kind of help you narrow it down. Another reason we do that is if you ever wanted to go back to stock, which nowadays with the value of these cars, that is a bit of a concern for people. So we pretty much left the factory wiring so you can revert back to OEM if you had to. You might have to do a little bit of modification here, but at least it's not completely disabled, and it still has a bit of a control to it. So we're going to go ahead and now we're going to connect our power trigger wire. So we're going to have a power wire triggering our relay, and then a chassis ground on the other side of the relay, turning the relay on. So when your standard fuel pump trigger wire goes off, turns this relay on, it'll turn this relay on. That'll be your 14 volts directly to your fuel pump, and you'll get that extra voltage to the pump that we talked about at the start. For the next connection we're going to be using this style of crimp connector. This is very good for a smaller gauge wire. Again, crimp connectors are much better, offer much longer longevity, and they still allow the wire to flex with vibrations and movement. Okay, up next we're going to do one of our ground wires. I've already done the larger one. Pretty much the same steps in the larger one as well as we do with this one, except this one is going to have a bit of an extra step, just like in the start of the video, with a smaller gauge wire on the same size connector, which is a M6 eyelet. So for this one, we're just going to do the double fold. So you fold it over once, or the single fold, sorry. All right, so the last step here is going to be installing our ground terminals. We'll have 2 ground terminals. Our first ground terminal is going to be the fuel pump ground. Our second ground terminal is going to be our relay ground terminal here. So we're just going to go ahead, we're going to clean the hole here next to this one here. This one's mounting the relay, this one's going to be our ground. So we're just going to clean the paint off of it to get down to the metal. To do this, we're just using a wire brush that's pretty much been used for this its whole life. So it's a very perfect circle. It cleans off the paint pretty quickly in a nice uniform circle. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to install these 2 eyelets on the back side. The reason I'm installing them on the back side is so that they don't interfere with the interior panels. He's missing the rear half of his interior panel, so it's not that big of a deal, but this one panel here might interfere when you go to install it. So just to be safe, we're going to go ahead and install it on the back side. A couple final touches now that we have the fuel pump relay installed. I do have a piece of foam here I like to cut out and put back onto the wiring, just like factory. I make it a little bit bigger just so it's well, obviously the wiring is now a little bit larger, so it's going to take a bit more material. So I just cleaned off the surface here, remove any of the loose foam that's on there, and then I'm going to struggle to remove this backing. I don't know if there's like a white layer on here. Oh, there it goes. Nope. Holy crap, dude. I just don't know where it splits off, you know? Pretty sure it's right here. Ah, we've done it. So I just want to make sure the surface is clean so this stays and sticks. Obviously, if you have to take this off again, it's going to rip off. But this prevents any sort of vibration or anything that they saw here from the factory. Then your last step is just going to be, if you can fit this on there still, just to install the cap of this. Okay, so just like the connections in the back of the car, we're going to go ahead and do our last power wire here that we discussed earlier in the video. I always like to try and use a red shrink wrap, just so they can't be confused as a ground or anything like that if you happen to cover up the wire color. All right, so now that you've got your terminal installed, you can go ahead and install it to your battery terminal. There's a lot of different ways you're gonna have to do this depending on the type of battery terminal you have. For this one, it's easy. It's just a 2-bolt style. So we're gonna go ahead, we're just gonna bolt it up and bend the terminal to a 90 and tighten it down underneath. For you, you might have to remove this nut, install it on the side. If you have bolt-on terminals, say a GM or something like that, you might have to get a little creative to figure out how to install it. If it's an OEM Nissan terminal, you can sometimes get away with adding a nut here. Make sure you clean your surface to make sure the connection is good, but you can get away with adding a second nut here and attaching it to the side. This is obviously the ground terminal, but if you had a positive terminal, do the same thing. One of your last steps you want to do, obviously, is install your OEM fuel pump fuse, just like how we took it out, put it back in the same spot, and then we can go ahead and fire the car up. All right, now that you've got your OEM fuel pump fuse back in, you can go ahead, turn the key on, check for some fuel leaks if you don't see anything yet. Prime the key a couple of times, let fuel pressure build, check again, make sure you have no fuel leaks in the rear wherever you've removed the lines. You can go ahead and you can fire the car up.